Okay, so picture this. You're running a nonprofit in India, and boom, overnight, the entire rule book for your funding gets torn up and rewritten. That's pretty much what happened back in 2020 with this huge update to a law called the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, or FCRA for short. So let's get into it and see how that shakeup is still making waves across the whole sector.
So this law, the FCRA, it's not some new thing. It actually goes all the way back to 1976, and it got a pretty big tightening up in 2010. But what happened in September 2020 was on a whole other level. These changes were so sudden, so massive, that they basically blindsided the entire nonprofit world. And that's the huge shift we're going to unpack today.
All right, so how are we going to break this down? First, we're going to follow the money, see how the flow of funds is now controlled. Then we'll look at the new hurdles for day-to-day operations, get a handle on the government's much bigger role, and finally, wrap up with what this new reality really means for nonprofits trying to do their work.
Okay, let's kick things off with Section 1, the 2020 FCRA shakeup. And believe me, it was a turning point for India's entire nonprofit sector.
But before we get into all the nitty-gritty changes, let's just make sure we're on the same page. What is the FCRA even for? Well, at its heart, the law is there to regulate how nonprofits in India get money from overseas. And this is the important part, how they're actually allowed to use it.
Which brings us to Section 2, controlling the flow of funds. The first and maybe biggest impact of these 2020 changes was all about the money, completely changing how it could move around.
Okay, so one of the absolute biggest bombshells was the complete ban on something called sub-granting. Now, here's how it used to work. A big NGO could get foreign funding and then team up with a smaller local group to actually get a project done on the ground. That was totally normal, standard practice. The new rule? Nope, not allowed. It's now completely forbidden. If you get foreign funds, you can't transfer them to any other organization. Period.
And you can bet the impact was felt right away. One analysis called it a major blow, and not just for those local partnerships. It also hit international donors who use these bigger organizations as intermediaries to reach those smaller, grassroots projects. The whole collaborative model, it was just taken apart.
All right, the next big financial hit was on the budget for what's called administrative costs. For a long time, nonprofits could use up to 50% of their foreign funds for things like overhead. Well, the new rule comes in and just slashes that, down to only 20%. So what does a cut like that actually mean?
And it's really crucial to know what the government actually counts as administrative. We're talking about things like salaries for the management, office rent, travel for executives. But, and this is a big but, there's some good news for a lot of groups. The salaries for the people on the front lines, the doctors in the clinic, the teachers in a school, that's considered a program expense, not administrative overhead. So that's a key distinction.
But still, even with that exception, dropping from a 50% cap all the way down to 20%, that's a massive shock to the system. I mean, it forced thousands of organizations to completely tear up their budgets and rethink how they were staffed, practically overnight.
And if that wasn't enough, there's one final clampdown on the money. The best way to think about it is like this. Imagine every single stream of foreign money for every single NGO in the entire country now being forced through one tiny, super easily monitored funnel. Because that's basically what happened. All foreign contributions now have to be received in a specific account at the State Bank of India's main branch in New Delhi. That's it. One single entry point.
So it wasn't just about controlling the money. The new rules also changed the very makeup and structure of these organizations. Which brings us to our next section, new rules for operations. The new rules really zeroed in on making individuals accountable. Now, if you want to get or even just renew an FCRA registration, your organization has to provide the Aadhaar number, that's India's biometric ID, for every single one of your key leaders. And if you have any foreigners on your board, they need to provide a copy of their passport or OCI card, no exceptions. The new rules also brought in something that wasn't really there before, the option for an organization to voluntarily give up its FCRA registration, say if it just doesn't want to deal with foreign funds anymore. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a pretty straightforward way to opt out, right? But there's a huge catch.
And here it is. If a nonprofit surrenders its registration, any assets it built using foreign money, we're talking buildings like hospitals or schools, or even big financial endowments, they have to be handed over to a government authority. So walking away could mean leaving your entire legacy behind.
This idea of the government taking control of assets is a perfect lead-in to our next major theme, tighter government oversight. Because these amendments gave the Ministry of Home Affairs, the MHA, a lot more power. 360. Think about that number.
That's nearly a full year. In this new FCRA world, what on earth could possibly take 360 days?
Well, that's the new suspension period. If the MHA even suspects an NGO has broken a rule, it can launch an inquiry and just freeze the organization's registration and all of its foreign funds. The old limit for this kind of freeze was 180 days. Now it's been doubled to 360. That's almost a whole year where your foreign-funded work just grinds to a halt.
And even the routine stuff isn't routine anymore. That 5-year renewal for your registration, the MHA now treats it like a full-blown investigation. They conduct a detailed inquiry to make sure the organization hasn't done anything wrong, like misusing funds, causing communal tension, or worse. The bar for just continuing your work is just way, way higher now.
Okay, so with all these new rules for money and all this new oversight, what does it actually feel like to run a nonprofit in India today? That brings us to our last section, the new compliance reality.
Right off the bat, there are a few things that are just totally non-negotiable. First, every single organization has to get a special ID from the government's NITI Aayog portal. Step 2, they have to open that mandatory bank account at the SBI main branch in New Delhi. And step 3, they've got to submit the Aadhaar details for all their key people. These are basically the new tickets to even play the game.
The paperwork burden has also just exploded. When it's time to file their annual returns, the head of the organization now has to personally go down a long list of questions and declare yes or no to each one. Have you transferred funds? No. Have you spent more than 20% on admin? No. Has anyone on your board been prosecuted? It's this incredibly exhaustive checklist you have to get through every single year.
And hey, if you want one last example of just how detailed this new level of control is, get this. It used to be that an NGO only had to tell the MHA if more than half of its board members changed. Now, if even a single new person joins or leaves the board, it requires formal approval from the MHA. Every tiny change is now being watched. So when you put it all together, these 2020 changes weren't just a few new rules. They really did reshape the entire landscape. They centralized control over money, they massively increased government oversight, and they basically took apart the old collaborative models. And all of that leaves us with a really big, critical question. With the rulebook this tight and collaboration so restricted, what does the future really look like for grassroots activism and social change in India?